All right, so we should be ready to start now. And this is the beginning of the Political Economy and Demand-Led Growth in India and China session here in the Demand-Led Workshop on Federal University of Rio de Janeiro 2023. I have alongside with me Esther Majerowicz from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. She will comment on her research about wage setting in China's transition. And right after her, we will have Manoel Gonzalo from Universidade Nacional de Quilmes, National University of Quilmes. He will present the book, actually, or part of the book, entitled India from Latin America, Peripherization, State Building, and Demand-Led Growth. My name is Gabriel Porto. I'm a PhD student here in the Institute of Economics, and I'm stepping in from Professor Carlos Pinkusfeld. Unfortunately, he's on sick leave, but we hope that he will be just fine, just soon. For rules of engagement, we have a hard stop at 12:30, so I'll ask the participants and everyone to stick with the time, and we will have a round of questions right after the presentation. So without further ado, please, Esther, the floor is yours.
Good morning to you all. Today I'm presenting on wage setting in China's transition. At the turn of the 21st century, we know that China has become the factory of the world, and for a long time this position was based on the low wages of Chinese unskilled workers. So until the 90s, up to the mid-2000s, the low and stagnant wages of unskilled workers were the base of China's ascension as the factory of the world. However, since mid-2000s, real wages of the Chinese workers started to rise. And there was a lot of complaint about the rising Chinese wages, particularly from transnational corporations. And there was a lot of debate about why these wages started to rise. And an hegemonic narrative solidified, and that stated that there was the end of the era of surplus labor. China would have achieved the Lewisian turning point. That means when all labor surplus is released from the traditional non-capitalist sector and was absorbed in the modern capitalist sector. This would mean that China would have stopped being a surplus labor economy and would have started being or be passing through a phase of scarcity of labor, which would ultimately explain the wage hikes. So neoclassical economics would start operating again, explaining wage setting in China, or the relative scarcity of factors would start determining wages in China. Well, this is a very bold assumption because we were talking here at the time of the most populous country in the world, and suddenly we are talking about labor shortages. How come? So in here we'll provide an alternative explanation about why Chinese wages started to rise in a frame of the classical political economy. So insofar we are constrained to a supply-demand analysis, labor surplus would be antithetical to sustained wage growth, so leading many to dismiss the existence of surplus labor in China. However, wage rates have also political determinants, and we will see the role of class struggle in China in the determination of Chinese wage rates. China, like any capitalist economy, is not labor scarce, and particularly China is not labor scarce. Capitalist development also produces labor surplus, or the industrial reserve army. So here, while labor scarcity was being debated, capitalist development in China was leading to the building up of a massive industrial reserve army of labor that is greater than ever before. So since the Lewisian framework that was called upon to explain wage setting in China accrues labor surplus exclusively to the non-capitalist sector, not allowing for disguised or open unemployment in the capitalist sector, most academics have been blind to such a process of labor surplus creation in the capitalist sector. So instead of labor scarcity, the Chinese Communist Party has been dealing with the problem that governments in the world have been dealing in general, which is the problem of employment generation, and not the other problem of labor shortages. So, in this paper, which is a chapter of a book that we launched last year in Brazil, and now is a paper that was published in the Bulletin of Political Economy last year, we explore how the Chinese Industrial Reserve Army, which is produced and reproduced through the rural-urban divide, influences the wage rate formation, but we also call upon the evolution of class struggle and state policies responding to it, to stress the mechanisms through which the CCP has been able to affect wage determination. So we call class struggle in the Industrial Reserve Army, which is labor surplus, and also institutional mechanisms to stress how wage determination has been achieved in China. All these factors taken together explain the broad patterns of wage behavior that we're trying to explain here, which are the two stylized facts that are from the 90s up to mid-2000, low and stagnant wages, and from the mid-2000 onwards, rising real wage rates. So, since this story about the production of labor surplus or the production of redundant workers is also a story about the production of the proletarian. So we're also trying to tell both stories at the same time, which was led or created by the party states. Since we are talking about transition, initially there was no initial bourgeoisie in China. The only one capable of creating this proletarian and the redundant proletarian was the Chinese Communist Party. So we are talking about proletarianization as well. So in here, I'll give you a picture about the structural transformation that China has undergone. This is the employment structure. So we are talking about a massive shift, a massive structural transformation about the economy. So the economy has moved away from the primary sector. This is the percentage of employment in the primary sector in 1978. When reforms started, we have 70% of employment in agriculture, and we have seen the economy moving in the direction of the secondary, but mostly to the tertiary sector. So this is a massive shift, but what these lines doesn't tell us is that this appears to be an homogeneous process of decline of the primary sector, but there's a lot going on here that these lines doesn't tell us, which are, for instance, in the blue line, we have seen massive transformation in the social relations of production. We have seen decollectivization of rural lands. We have seen the emergence of an economy of small independent commodity producers. Then we have witnessed a process of semi-proletarianization, and then we have moved towards full wage labor. So we have seen various processes which have been marked by intensified class struggle, and this is a story that these numbers doesn't show. And also, on the other lines, we have seen that these have, for instance, in the gray line, we have seen also the production of disguised unemployment through capitalist development, which is also doesn't show in the lines. So this is what majorly we are trying to show in this paper, the stories behind the two lines of the structural change that's not told when we just look to the major sectors. These are the absolute numbers entailed in the structural transformation between the sectors. We also have an economy that has moved away from the rural employment towards urban employment at a slower rate than the movement from the primary sector towards the secondary and the tertiary. And these are the absolute numbers. So before we analyze the story in China particularly, I would like to make some remarks, some considerations of theoretical nature. And I will go back to the blue line. about what's going on in China, in the blue line, in the story of what's propelling people to go out of agriculture, what's expelling people from agriculture towards the secondary and the tertiary sector. We need to tell the story. So, as I told you initially, in the beginning of the reforms, we had an economy that was collective in its nature in the countryside. So in the early days of reform, what we witnessed in China is a major agrarian reform that will promote the collectivization of rural lands towards the agrarian reform that redistributes lands in equally small plots to each rural households in the household responsibility system, which will produce an economy of small independent commodity producers. So in the beginning of this period, we can think of agricultural employments being composed by the peasantry. So we have all agricultural employments being composed by the peasantry. So when we see the blue line falling, we are talking about the process of depeasantization. This is what we are talking about. So how can we achieve depeasantization? Not we, the Chinese Communist Party, for sure. Well, when we think about depeasantization, we go straight to the classic English case and we think about land enclosures. But that's not what's happening in China. It's also primitive accumulation because it's a process led by political power, not by economic means, but it's majorly through overtaxation. So the state, by achieving overtaxation, not by taking the means of production, not by expropriating the land of the peasants, it turns direct producers into the sellers of labor power. Because what should concern us here is not exclusive land, but more broadly, the conditions of the subsistence of the peasants, thereby compelling direct producers towards the markets to obtain the means of subsistence in the products markets, including through the selling of their labor power in the labor markets. So here, agricultural producers may enter into a process of semi-proletarianization, and we have land that's not expropriated, but labor power is commodified if needed, in addition to household production to guarantee subsistence. So this is what's happening in China for a long period. So the state is extracting surplus from households, from direct producers, and creating the need for the proletarianization, for this semi-proletarianization. We have also other means to achieve depeasantization, which are also economic means. For instance, economic expropriation might occur when the products of agricultural producers become commodified. So we can create dependence on contractors by capital concentration upstream and downstream, and then you have the property of the land, but you cannot control, because you have the property of the land, the productive process. You are divided, you have a sham property. For instance, you depend on contractors for the means of production other than the land, for machinery, for seeds, for marketing. So the whole process, the whole productive process is controlled by your contractors, and you produce for the surplus of the contractors, you are reduced as a wage labor, even though you retain the land. So there is an economic expropriation of such. And there is also economic expropriation as a result of the law of competition. However, since we are talking here about this kind of agrarian reform that happened in China, as people retained use rights, but the collectives, the local government retained property rights, land could not be sold. So you cannot sell land, you cannot concentrate land, hence you cannot expropriate land from the peasants. So economic expropriation is not the main route for achieving depeasantization. So it's a very particular process of depeasantization that does not follow the routes of the English classic case. So this is important to retain for us to analyze the blue line of the primary sector decrease. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the other lines that we see, how the secondary sector, how the tertiary sector will absorb labor, and how at the same time they will produce their own redundant laborers, how they will create surplus labor. And that has to do with Marx's theory of the industrial reserve army. Just a second. So, besides the cyclic components of the industrial reserve army, that has to do with the different phases of the business cycle, which tighten or lose competition among workers, we also have three forms of the industrial reserve army that always exist. We have the floating component of the industrial reserve army, that is not the most important for our analysis in here, which has to do to the centers of modern industry, and it's directly associated with technological displacement of workers and the fast consumption of the workers' productive lifespan. And also we have the latent components of the industrial reserve army. In here it's important to see that this component is found in agriculture, but it has nothing to do with the peasantization. In here, it is about wage labor in agriculture and how capitalist accumulation in agriculture produces technological progress, endogenous technological progress, which turns wage labor redundant. So it has to do with the dynamic of capital accumulation in agriculture. So it's when capitalist relations penetrate agriculture. And we have then the stagnant components of the industrial reserve army, which is a byproduct of capital accumulation in modern industry and agriculture. It recruits itself constantly from the supernumerary forces of modern industry and agriculture. Its extent grows as with the extent and energy of accumulation. The creation of surplus population advances. This form is defined by having a precarious and intermittent attachment to capital, placing it simultaneously in the active and reserve army. It's defined by the irregular relation to capital. So when we think about, in the literature of economic development, of disguised unemployment, or more recently, when we think about the precariat or precariousness, we are thinking about what Marx is talking here, that capitalism development produces this precariousness among workers. It's a feature of capitalist development, and it grows even more as capital accumulates. So it's the tendency of the industrial reserve army is to be this sector of the industrial reserve army to grow faster than the other sectors. So this is already seen by Marx. So, and this is what we will see in China. We will see that these components will grow in size as China develops. We will see that these disguised unemployment, like petty traders, food truck vendors, and street vendors, and personal servants, domestic industry, all of these will grow as China develops. So now I will talk a little bit about what can we say about the different stages of the peasantization and how this relates to wage setting in China and class struggle. So we can think about two moments. I said that there was an initial period when there was an agrarian reform in China that promoted the institutionalized and small peasantry, and that was also followed by a series of pro-peasantry policies that increased productivity, farming real income, and there were a lot of incentives towards productive specialization. However, by 1985, a phase of stagnation and even decline of farming real income ensued. there were a lot of state policies that led to an agrarian social crisis in this period. So from 1985 to 2004, there were a series of policies that bankrupted the countryside. Central government policies of investment and finances through state-owned bank had a strong bias towards urban areas and manufacturing. Pricing policies, real net transfers, and transfers through the credit system amounted to a 20% loss of agricultural GDP. This led local governments to increase tax collections from the peasantry. So, in this period, is marked by the overtaxation of peasants, and there is therefore the party stated promoted the peasantization mostly through extra-economically, that means through primitive accumulation, extracting peasants' rising surplus product. Why I'm saying that's a rising surplus product? Because as we've seen, there is less and less people in agriculture, but China is not importing increasingly more and more and more, proportionally more grains. China, most of China's consumption of grains is provided internally, so you have increasing productivity in grain production with less and less people. So you have rising surplus products, and you have increasing overtaxation. So you extract more and more surplus to maintain real farming stagnant, incomes stagnant. So these incomes, the stagnant incomes, will be the base from which wages in the manufacturing sector will be kept stagnant as well. So these incomes will set the floor of the wage scale in the country, which will be artificially produced by the state. So by setting the real income from farming households, the party state was able to propel proletarianization in as much as households could not socially reproduce adequately, control its pace, and set the base level for China's wage scale. So there was also expropriation of land for infrastructure and urban projects, but this played an ancillary role in the peasantization. And agricultural land also played the role of social security for migrants. In as much as you could not find jobs anymore, you could always come back to the countryside and rely on the income from farming. So consequently, household farming real income was proletarianization departure points, and for most rural migrant workers, their last resource. So avoiding the production of official pauperism. So you can see how it's possible that you have fast growth, as China had, with low wages, and at the same time you don't see the production of a lot of paupers, official pauperism skyrocketing, because you have this net that represents the lands to migrants, so a sort of social security. So this setting was unsustainable not because of unbalanced consumption and so on and so forth. It was unsustainable because of class struggle. This setting was, at some point, class struggle intensified in the countryside, intensified in export zones, and social unrest among peasants was mainly a response of heavy tax burdens and land grabs. So in 2004, peasant protests gained momentum. You had 74,000 protests and riots taking place in China, involving more than 3 million people. Many of them were led by rural poor. So, and the party state responded to that, because this could eventually unify, and this could eventually be a threat to the political stability of China. So the party stated changed the course of its policies towards the countryside and towards the determination of real incomes in of farming. So you had the abolition in 2004 of all these agricultural taxes. You had a series of abolition of taxes towards the countryside from 2004 up to 2007. You had a series of agricultural subsidies that were granted to rural households. And you had also a changing in the pricing policies of agricultural foods. So in 2004, the CCP established state annual minimum procurement prices for grains, offering to buy unlimited amounts of major grains while limiting imports, thereby influencing the setting of domestic market prices. These minimum prices following the movement of intermediate inputs, themselves subject to regulation, and therefore the state effectively determines rural incomes from grain production. And from 2004 up to 2015, minimum grain procurement prices were increased yearly. So you see that there was a major shift towards the determination of rural incomes from farming that were a response for the increased clashes that peasants led in the countryside. This had an impact on the wages in manufacturing export zones, because those who were working in manufacturing export zones were those who were coming from the countryside. We were not accept low wages anymore if we can gain more in agriculture. So wages in the manufacturing sector had to rise in order for migrants to accept new jobs. So the actions implemented in the mid-2000s as a result of the clashes of the peasants were felt in the proletarianization dynamics. This explains much of the labor shortage and wage growth in coastal manufacturing zones. So to attract back workers, manufacturing enterprises had to increase wages substantially while labor bargaining power expanded. The expansion of labor bargaining power was not the manifestation of a shortage, absolute shortage of workers, but instead, the end of the era of surplus labor, but instead of the increased bargaining power of workers who were in better condition due to their increased clashes in the countryside and increased clashes in manufacturing export zones. So the workers also clashed in, industrial workers also clashed in manufacturing export zones, fighting capital, and the state also promoted institutional changes to create some support for rural migrant workers to curb labor unrest. It implemented social security structures, although modest, and regional minimum wages. On the one hand, the state gave carrots, but on the other hand, the state had also increased repression. So the state had increased the spending in the stability funds, which since then, for internal security, is greater spending than what the state spends in military, in national defense since 2011. So, how long do I have? So what we might think then is since these clashes were victorious, the peasantry would have been strengthened. No, so yes and no. Since real income from farming increased, peasants had better prices, but since 2004, a new strategy was put in place to achieve the peasantization. The party stated conceived a strategy that now aims towards the full proletarianization and not just semi-proletarianization. What it aims now is to to promote capitalist accumulation in agriculture, particularly following the American model of agribusiness. And in order to do so, the deconcentrated land structure is no longer viable. It has to concentrate land, it has to create a land market, and it promoted institutional changes, creating a land rental market that now has already transferred land up to almost 40% of the land in large-scale units. And it's now, you now can see a lot of wage-labor relations spreading in agriculture. So now the main form of depeasantization is through economic means, through the operation of the law of the competition, and also through contract farming. So if we consider now the agribusiness model, now you can see that we still have 23% of employment in agriculture. And if we consider the agribusiness model, which is now what the CCP aim as a model of development for China's agriculture, we can see that the United States, which inspires the CCP, has 1.4% of its labor force in agriculture. If the CCP were to mimic this model of development, it still has a lot of room for releasing labor from agriculture. So agriculture is still bloated. You still have a lot of technical progress to release labor in this model of capitalist development. So we would estimate it having the US model as benchmark, that 160 million laborers are still to be released if China was to achieve the proportion of the US with 1.4% of the labor force in agriculture. So there is still a lot of room for technical progress. So, and regarding the story of the gray line and the orange line, or that means how capitalist development creates surplus labor, and I will not be able to tell the whole story here. We can see that one of these traits of the creation of the stagnant form of the industrial reserve army is that self-employment has been growing very fast and continuously in China. No, these are the casuals, the pet traders, the domestic servants. So in this green line in 2019, we can see that the rural self-employed were approximately 60 million. And if we count in urban areas, the orange line, we can see that the urban self-employed were 116 million. So we have 23% of the labor force in China in self-employment. So considering that we have 23% of the labor force employed in agriculture, plus 23% of the labor force employed in self-employment, we see that we have a massive proportion of the labor force in activities that can be considered still surplus labor. So this idea that China has reached the scarcity of labor is absolutely different from reality. You know, China has been finding it difficult. The CCP has been struggling to create employment that is high productivity for all the population, you know, and creating employment that could absorb all the population. So in this sense, the opposite is what's happening in China now. And with this, I conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther, for being very precise with the time. That's very much appreciated. And now the floor is yours, Manoel. Thank you.
So I will present part of this book that mainly it is a subproduct of my PhD thesis here in Universidad Federal de Rio de Janeiro. We pay special attention to different geopolitical, technological, financial, and institutional aspects of the Indian Ocean and the Indian subcontinent. Well, as I said, it's part of my, it's a subproduct of my PhD thesis. I was oriented by José Casiolato and Eduardo Crespo. This book or this thesis had fieldwork in India of around 4 months, and it includes an in-depth review of Indian authors, and also in the book you will find a lot of maps, data, and statistics on India and the Indian subcontinent. Well, this is the book. The book has 3 parts that are there in the title. The first part is this idea of peripherization, that it mainly introduces and discusses the main features of the Indian Ocean and the Indian subcontinent. This is the first part of the book. It's like a long-term view, so this is around 15th or 16th century that we are discussing this. The second part discusses the Indian state building, mainly trying to build a dialogue between national system of innovation perspective and development state and interstate competition authors. And finally, the third part that I will try to focus on this part here, discuss the Indian growth acceleration since the 90s, with giving a geopolitical framework of the Indian Ocean to this discussion. So, as I think that this is a little bit in line with the last session of yesterday. The book has like a Latin American approach in the sense that mainly it adopts the historical structuralism in order to discuss India. Of course, Furtado, but I really like Cayo Prado in this sense. Then the idea of center-periphery of Prebisch and structural heterogeneity of Pinto, that seems to be a category that is being built also for India. And then we will come back to this. A second block of literature discuss mainly, there are different Latin American contributions on interstate global competition and a broad understanding of the national system of innovation. In this sense, it is much more linked to List and Freeman and not to Lundvall. This is neo-Schumpeterian, but you all know about this literature. And finally, mainly the contributions of Franklin, Fabio, and all the people here. I will go fast here in these first 2 parts, and I will try to speak a little bit more on the third part. Mainly the first part of the book is based in this area of the world. It introduced the features of the Indian Ocean, and it tried to build a narrative where the Indian Ocean and also China were the center of the war until the beginning of the 18th century. In this sense, as we can see here, until the middle of the 18th century, India and China represent around half of the world manufacturing output, and at the end of the 19th century, after the British penetration and colonization in Asia, they are represent less than 5% of the GDP of the world manufacturing output. This, of course, include a process of different process, but this process of primarization of the Indian exports. This primarization was mainly produced during this period between 1810 and the first half of the 19th century. We see a really downgrading in the Indian export of textile exports and a rise in opium, mainly to China, in the export of opium to China, sugar, and raw cotton. This is there's no contribution of me in this part. What I try to do in this part is because most of the literature is concentrated in the discussion of deindustrialization, and perhaps deindustrialization is, of course, the main phenomenon that we see, but this process is, in some sense, a broader process, and I call this process like a peripherization, and this peripherization implied price and non-price. It means non-coercive and coercive mechanisms that finally ended with the logistic and trade control coordinated by the British actors, territorial penetration and urban restructuring of the Indian subcontinent, a structural change of the Indian subcontinent, and institutional, infrastructure, financial, and autonomous expenditure subordination to the British needs. With a completely different demographic and natural resources structure to Latin American, the Indian-British-led export model was a disaster in terms of growth, economic development, and social welfare. In this sense, we all know this in some sense, but I think that it is interesting from a Latin American scholar in which sense? That this process was even broader or much deeper than our process of global insertion, because it included a huge downgrading in the export and productive profile of India. Well, so this is the first, there are like 3 chapters on this and a lot of information. Then we have the second chapter that mainly introduced the Indian reemergence in terms of growth during mainly the 20th and 21st century. As we can see, if we see the 20th and 21st century, India experienced an acceleration in its growth. From Nehru, that we have 3.5 GDP growth. Then in India, during the 80s, it's different. For example, for us, it was a lost decade, and for India, it was a decade of 5.6 GDP growth. And finally, this last decades of around 7% GDP growth. In this second part, this is discussed mainly the main features of the national system of innovation of India. Of course, that to discuss this national system of innovation and the state building of India, the geopolitical issues are of main relevance to understand why India have developed different capabilities in some areas. There are other discussions on this part, such as the role of the interwars period, the Nehruvian state building, different shocks that India had, such as the Pakistan war and independence, the petroleum shocks that obliged Indira Gandhi to make technological efforts in order to achieve or to deal with a difficult external constraint. Finally, it's interesting to discuss the 80s of India comparing with Latin America, in which sense that India, for example, arrived the 80s with low FDI, low external debt, and in some sense, during the 80s, started a deepening in the external debt and FDI. This process was a combined process that included an internal liberalization and increase in government expenditures, and also some redefinition in the self-reliance model of India. So, which are some similarities with Latin America and some differences? Of course, that in the role of the state, some inward-looking oriented policies and industrialization with marginalization. and common features of this period between India and Latin America. But there are also some differences. There are much more state-owned enterprises and a science-led linear model of innovation in India. The 80s, that were a lost decade for Latam, for Latin America, were a period of increasing growth in India. And this was mainly fueled by an expansion of government expenditure with some increase in external debt and FDI. This paradox of the moon and the ghetto is a paradox that is introduced to discuss the US, in the sense that the US could reach the moon, but still have the ghettos in Harlem with AIDS. Well, this metaphor could also really apply to the case of India. Well, but let's advance to this third part that I think that it's more in line with the audience. This is like the big picture of this part. In political terms, we can see that the Congress Party has passed to BJP Party. This implies a more national Hindutva policy in terms of Hindu style of development. They have different implications. The Indian Ocean has turned to be a main geopolitical chessboard for the world, in the sense that, for example, now most of the Germany, US, France have an Indo-Pacific strategy. In this sense, for the US, India occupy a main place to counterbalance China. So with the downfall of the URSS and China's growth, for India, the relationships with the US have grown and have turned to be really important. So, in terms of growth, in the book, I try to make like a classification of the main Indian views on growth. We have a first stream of works on liberalization and trade that mainly explain growth because of liberalization and trade. Then there's another authors that explain the growth because of business environment. Some neo-Marxists, such as Chandrasekhar, Yayati Ghosh, and then some demand-side works, mainly Rakshit, that is an Indian macroeconomist, and also Bernengo has one work with an Indian economist, and some eclectic approach. So, which is my main view here, yeah? That from the 90s to 2015, that is mainly the period that is discussed in this part of the book, private consumption was a main driver of growth, followed by public and private contribution to gross domestic capital formation and exports. So how can we introduce a narrative on this? Upper class and caste autonomous consumption, mainly fueled by credit boom and global capital inflows, government and private investment in infrastructure, construction, and real estate, mainly pushed by the energy and urbanization pressures that are there in India. Of course, that export has made a contribution, mainly explained by the particular role of the Indian diaspora in the US and the complementation between the Indian capabilities and the US outsourcing opportunities. And finally, in terms of the government expenditure, despite since the new economic policy, there's an intention to reduce the role of the state in the economy. However, the government role in the economy did not reduce less than 20-25% GDP of the GDP. Well, I will not speak about this discussion of geopolitical discussion. This is the relevance that is having the Indo-Pacific for the US now. In the last, at the beginning of the year, Biden was there and launched the IPEF, that it was like some money to finance green infrastructure and different infrastructure. So we can see here the Indian deceleration in growth from around 5.5 to around 7% of GDP growth. Here, this is like the summary of these different views on growth with the different authors, but what is like the main reference in terms of the liberal approach. Then we have the channels of growth. This is mainly the one of liberalization, explain growth because of export and an increase in the efficiency in the Indian economy because of the open and the liberalization process. Then there are some authors, neo-Keynesians, such as Roderick, that stated that there was like a change in the attitude with the Indian business groups. So investment grow because of this change in the attitude to the Indian business groups. Then we have the neo-Marxist approach, such as Bhaduri, Ghosh, Chandrasekhar, that perhaps they have different differences between them, but they introduce the idea of the growth is being pushed by consumption of upper caste class. Also, they speak about construction and real estate. Also, for example, Chandrasekhar introduced the role of credit. Perhaps to advance a little bit, the main difference between what I will present with these authors is that they are like saying that this growth is financial-led and it's mainly like a bubble. But I mean, this like 3 decades of a bubble, it's like a little bit difficult, or I would like to have a bubble like this in some sense. This view is really interesting in order to introduce some elements of also a demand-led growth approach. From the demand side, there's a work of Nell that mainly explain this growth of exports as a consequence of the capabilities developed by India and a little bit by government expenditure. Then we have this work of Navar, Bhaduri, and Bernengo that's mainly introduced export and consumption. And Rakshit, that I really like this guy, he introduced a mix of domestic consumption, export, and government expenditures. Then we have different, like, more eclectic approach, such as Nagaraj, that have a mix of explanations, Bardhan, and Deepak Nayar. That all these works are really interesting too. So a rough decomposition of growth that is introduced in the book. Of course, exports represent around 20% of GDP, or explain 20% of GDP growth between the period of between 90 and 2015. But we have that household final consumption represent 43 and 42, and gross domestic capital formation 30 or 32. I would like to find more on government expenditures, but we found around 6 or 7% to explain growth. There's I finally did not apply the super multiplier model to India because there are different problems with data particular to build the transference of the government, so it's a little bit difficult to build this series. But well, so how can we explain this? Because most of the views, or if you look at to the World Bank narrative on India, they will start on the export growth, and it's true. It has a role, but our intention was to show the internal process that were were in place in India, that like a main driver to explain growth. So what are these processes? These processes are mainly consumption, fueled by credit, and a little bit by wages. This consumption is mainly focused on upper and urban class and caste, and a process of rural financial inclusion. I mean, there are around 400 million people that now have a credit card in India. This process is new, and if you give credit to these people, they start buying different things. Then we have a process of, then we have gross domestic capital formation, mainly public, private, and this PPP, mainly focused on energy and transport and urbanization. This urbanization implies also construction and real estate. We will see some figures. There's a boom of real estate in India, but also some change, structural change in the rural construction. I mean, we will see some figures now that electrification is reaching the rural India and new houses are being built, and this implied a big push in demand. And at least, we cannot say more, there are counter-cyclical government expenditures. Even in each crisis, the government push government expenditure. Well, this is the role of credit. I mean, private credit has gone for around 20% of GDP in the 90s to 50% in the 2015 and so on. Not at the level of China, but salaries are increasing in slowly, a little bit or more slowly than China, but salaries are increasing in India. It is true that still labor market is around 50% of labor market is informal, but formal salaries are increasing. Here we have gross domestic capital formation, public, the government represents around 8%, and here we have a really strong increase in household expenditure. There is a big discussion of what this household and residential expenditure represent, because, well, there's a methodological discussion, but what it is, I mean, there's a process that this is happening, is that people is investing in building their houses, the government is investing in building different routes and transport, and this process is really important in terms of this residential investment. I think that the new super multipliers models are working on this, on the effect of household debt. So I think that something with this could be done. This is the infrastructure expenditure. India is around 8% in terms of GDP of investment in infrastructure. As I said, mainly in energy and in transport. And here what I was saying, the sectoral composition of the gross domestic capital formation, we can see that real estate have gone, and this like professional service, have gone from 10% to 25%. This is a huge increase of real estate. Also, we can add construction, yeah, here. So it's around 30% of gross domestic capital formation represented by construction and real estate. Of course, that this process is linked to the process of urbanization that is occurring in India. And on the other side, we have that agriculture, yeah, is going down from 20% to 7%. This is really, the data is a little bit old, but this tendency, this trend is really interesting in the sense that these kucha houses are mainly mud houses, and these puka houses are brick, cement, and electricity houses. So we have that houses made with bricks, cement, and electricity have gone from around 57% to 93% in India. This is like a structural change in the way that they are building houses. Of course, this is linked with the process of electrification this process of electrification, you can say, well, they were really bad because it was only 45%, but as we know, the delta is important in order to explain growth. There's also discussion here. For example, Yayati Ghosh is saying that this process is heterogeneous, and of course it is heterogeneous, but this is advancing. This is what I was saying about the role of the government expenditure. In every crisis, we will see that a jump in government expenditure, of course, because of GDP goes down, but also because of the government react to this, to any decline in the GDP growth. And now, perhaps the history that is 5 minutes, yeah, the history that is more known by all of us, that had to be with the role of the external sector. Here we have software and services export boom, remittances, that is a main aspect of the Indian economy, because we are talking about around 3.5 of GDP, mainly from the US, the Arab countries, and UK. In this World Cup, we have seen different South Asian people in the Arab countries, in Qatar. These people were mainly South Asian people that was working there, and they send remittances to India. And these remittances, this is in some sense in line with the difference that stated Esteban yesterday between GDP and income, in the sense that if you have 3.5 GDP in terms of remittances, you have a better income. And in terms of course, capital inflow from the US, and this is like international hotspot. There's different literature that speak about black money from the Maldives entering India, such as, but this is in macroeconomic terms, this is good because they are capital inflows. This is the role of exports. Of course, 1/3 of these exports are mainly services exports and mainly to the US. This is the boom in remittances from 1 point of GDP during the 80s to around, in some years, we have 4 point of GDP of remittances. Well, India is at the top of the countries in terms of remittances. This is the Indian American population by states. The first state in terms of Indian American population is California, and most of the CEOs and CFOs and all these top management people are related to the Indian American community. Well, it's not easy to see this, but mainly it's to explain the external sector. India have a superávit in terms of invisibles. This is mainly the export of services. Then you have current receipts, this includes remittances, and FDI, that mainly finance the Indian external sector, that has gone to a solid external position of around 400 billion in 2018. During the Ukraine war, India lost around 100 billion reserves because of the energy needs. This is why India is buying Russian petroleum, because 1/3 of the Indian exports are related of the Indian imports are related to the energy needs. So, in order to conclude, we all know, and I also know, that I am not introducing like an apology of the Indian growth. There are many debts in terms of the Indian growth, in terms of structural heterogeneity, and there are a review in the book in terms of income distribution, gender, regional, religious. This idea of the moon and the ghetto, and the different models and issues that we have for example, Kerala and Gujarat. Well, to reflect a little bit on this, There's a final chapter where a discussion is introduced in terms of like Bell India's growth acceleration and this Furtado versus Tavares and Serra debate in India. In which sense? That the Brazilian miracle was mainly explained that because of state-owned enterprises, also infrastructure and real estate, multinational firms, and upper-class autonomous expenditure. So in the debate with Furtado, the idea was that you will have not stagnation, but you will have growth with income concentration. So what we have in the Indian miracle in the 21st century? Growth acceleration with a growing health concentration, but we have to say that socioeconomic indicators are improving. Of course, that India has a main relevance for the youth. I already said this, and this helped India to receive capital inflows, FDI, and technological support. In this sense, what we are seeing is a transformation in the role of the state from direct industrial production to infrastructure development. Mainly all these PPPs are being financed by the state, and the Indian business groups are in a close relationship with the state. And of course, there are main internal dynamics linked with urbanization, infrastructure, and anti-cyclical policy. So, challenges and help for future research. Well, this discussion of, is this a bubble? 3 decades of a bubble? For me, it was a little bit difficult to follow the role of government transferences and to make a more stylized version of the supermultiplier, both because of data and some technicalities. Improving and stylizing the Belindia insights. I have some idea of these semi-autonomous investments between private-public partnerships, for example, in infrastructure. Better capture the debt plus real estate in gross performance. Well, this economics of the Indo-Pacific, and well, thank you very much for the space.
Many thanks to both of the presenters. We have budgeted time for more or less a round of questions, so I would like to ask our qualified audience here if there are anyone interested in posing questions to our two speakers. Oh, I see a question there. So if you could come up here, we have a mic.
Thank you for the presentations. For the first presenter, I have only one specific question about the self-sufficient of China's supply of grain, and also because they are the main importers of grain from Latin America. So if you can extend your explanation about that. And for the second one, I will buy the book and also I will read it. So, but I have a question about how is the mechanism through which the consumption of the upper class trigger a process of development? Because if that is the story, we can say that the problem is not the inequality in Latin America, is the way that the rich people spend their money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? No? I will add a very quick question, but just if you two guys could conclude with some thoughts about, again, you both mentioned in your presentations, but why is it interesting for a Latin American scholar to look at these very distant geographical cases? In a few words, I think that would be a good way to wrap up. So thank you both so much. Who would like to begin? You can begin.
Well, thank you for the questions. Regarding major grains, yeah, it should be made a qualification about what I said. I was talking about major grains for people consumption, not soy, which is for animal consumption. So you have a policy of food security, which is of major grains for people consumption should have the most autonomy as possible for in case of any scenario of geopolitical disruption or in any case you should be self-sufficient as much as possible. So in major grains like sorghum or maybe rice, you have 95% of the supply or something more or so supplied domestically. You control the grain production as much as possible. So in this you have stocks and so on. So other grains that are not so essential maybe for animals, you might export. But some of the grains are considered the essential. They are mostly self-provided. And about why is it important to study this experience, I believe that there are two important points, general points. The first is about how the international, when the world economy shaped. Now you can see today how the world economy is shaped without China and how Brazil would be inserted in this world economy without understanding where China is going, where the Chinese economy is developing. And particularly in my case, I studied Chinese workers because I think what happens with Chinese workers is fundamental to the Chinese working class as a whole, because of the centrality of the manufacturing floor still for China and for the global economy, the manufacturing sector. And there is other dimension as well, which are the experience of development and which lessons we might derive that may be adapted to our particular historical and regional circumstances with all the adaptations needed and all the geopolitical and historical circumstances that may be translated to our reality. So I believe these are 2 points.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, in the case of India, upper caste and class people have a better access to education, and this also implies better quality of jobs, and this better quality of jobs also allow them to have access to credit. That we are saying that credit is a really relevant aspect of this growth process. So this group of people is around 30% of India that is in the formal labor market. So they have access to credit, they have access to education. So these people is mainly what I'm saying is that part of this story is mainly explained by the consumption of these people. I mean, it's like a Republican argument, but I find that part of this process is occurring. And you can see this when you go to these different shoppings that are being built in India, and you have this new middle class and new rich in India that are buying in these shopping centers. So I would say this to your question. And related to why this is important, well, in the same idea that was saying Esther, first, we all, I think, agree that Asia is turning the most dynamic area of capitalism, so we have to study Asia. Second, I find really interesting to make comparisons between India and Brazil. India and Brazil is like a line of research that is developed and could be much more developed. And in more practical terms, for Argentina, India represents 7,000 million exports and 1,000 million imports. So we have a superávit of around 6,000 million, mainly soybean exports. But if we join the superávit that we have with India, Vietnam, and one or two more countries of Asia, we compensate the deficit that we have with China. So this is important for us in this aspect.
Well, thank you very much. Round of applause for our presenters, Esther and Manoel. Thank you very much.